Hello everyone. Welcome to this second week of the course on civil resistance. Apologies for not having posted the video yesterday. I'm having a look at some of the comments you are making online, and perhaps one of the most important ones is one that you've reflected on already, where one of you pointed out that nonviolent movements, like you read in the literature, have twice as much of a chance as being successful as violent movements. And I think one of the other really important things we learn when we are learning about civil resistance movements is that even choosing tactics of violence together with nonviolence is not necessarily a good idea, because we tend to extract the worst of both. So what I want to do today is, in talking about civil resistance and in talking about the theme for this week, nonviolent movements and the strategies of nonviolent movements, is not to talk you through the material that's already on the USIP website, but to maybe point out really quickly what I think are some important points to be looking out for. And like I said, one of the strategies we're going to be using this time around with civil resistance is, of course, going through all of the material that's there. It can be cumbersome at times with the video and the audio and all of the transcripts, but I would encourage you to manage your time well and do your best to go through all of that material. But in these sessions, I'll just, when we're not having a synchronous week or when we're not meeting synchronously, is just give you some ideas on what I think are important aspects to focus on. One of the things that stands out is the pillars of support that prop up a system. And we know that that can be the educational system, the religious or cultural institutions, the media, and security forces. So very often these are elements that prop up a system, perhaps sometimes, even authoritarian systems. But I want you to think a little more creatively about this. One of the other ways to look at this is to think about what we call ISA and RSA. And one of the important ways in which to think about this is to always think about a real life example of a conflict that you're aware of or a conflict that you might have learned about. My own bias is looking at conflicts in Southern Africa and looking at, liberation movements that have now come to be in power, like Frelimo, like SWAPO, like the African National Congress, and like many other movements in Southern Africa. In each of these cases, these colonial or apartheid or oppressive administrations or regimes were kept in power because the states used what we call, in the face of civil resistance, they used one, ISA, the ideological state apparatus. And very often that was made up of the media, the educational system, and other forms of using ideology to oppress people. The second element is what we call RSA, and that's the repressive state apparatus. So in the face of civil resistance, we sometimes have the whole idea of RSA. And repressive state apparatus, RSA, is essentially the security forces, the military, the police. And we know that in many African contexts, RSA has been used to ensure that authoritarian and oppressive administrations remain in power. When we think about the strategic principles and what makes civil resistance movements effective, there are a whole range of them, right? But they essentially are around structural conditions and environmental factors. So I'd encourage you to pay particular attention to that when you're looking through the material. And of course, there are other factors like agency, skills, strategy, socioeconomic factors. And what stands out for me in the material is also the idea of unity. how unity in civil resistance and unity in movements that are fighting oppression or fighting oppressive regimes have the challenge of unity. And we've seen that many times where oppressors use the tactic of divide and rule. We've seen that from the Middle East to Asia. If you look at the past in Southern Asia, in East Asia, the oppressive forces or the oppressive regimes always used the strategy of divide and rule. Let's take an example in Southern Africa, Mozambique. Liberation came to Mozambique in 1975, right? So Frelimo, the liberation movement, was fighting against Portuguese colonization for many years prior to that. And there was unity in Frelimo. Frelimo comes to power in 1975. It's seen as a threat to its neighbor, South Africa, but it's also perceived as a threat by the US because this is the period of the Cold War, and there are concerns about Frelimo spreading its Marxist wings, because Frelimo was seen as a Marxist movement, to its neighbors like Namibia, then called Southwest Africa, and neighbors like South Africa, which was administered by an oppressive Afrikaner administration. So what did they do? The South Africans contributed to dividing Frelimo, to creating divisions within the liberation movement, and also with the Americans and other forces in the world funded Renamo. And the task of Renamo was to resist Frelimo. So ultimately the point I'm making here is that even when civil resistance movements are successful and united in their solidarity and united in their attempt to run a post-colonial society, there might be other forces that want to divide the success of a civil rights movement or a civil rights campaign. So think about the concept of unity carefully. It'll also be important to think about strategic planning. What are the tactics used? What are the tactical aspects? What are the capacity building aspects, etc. There's a nice graph drawn in the material that you have on the tactics of repression, and that might be worth looking at. And while you're looking at that, there's a whole checklist to end tyranny. I think those are essentially bullet points, but it might be worth drilling into them to try and understand the importance of each of them. The literature also makes the point about the importance of creating capable institutions. Remember, often when there's civil rights movements, when there are civil resistance movements, they might take place in the context where the concern is bringing down the oppressive administration. But very often, very little energy is given to the idea of building capable institutions. And we know from the colonial history in Asia and Latin America and Africa that when there were movements, both violent and non-violent, and we've had both across these, across various continents in the world, but one of the elements missing in fighting for liberation and fighting against colonialism or apartheid, depending on whatever applied, was the fact that those who were fighting did not do enough to build capable institutions to take power. And I'd once again refer you to the work of Fanon. I know some of you are reading Fanon's chapter concerning violence from Wretched of the Earth. If anyone's struggling to get an electronic copy of that, please do let me know. But I think it's fairly easily obtainable with a quick search online. But one of the points that Fanon makes about people who are resisting anti-colonial movements, movements that are fighting oppression and authoritarian regimes. And he says that those who fight against oppression, those who fight for freedom and are on the right side of history, are often not the best to govern in a post-colonial or a post-apartheid society. Now that might seem like a controversial statement and worth looking at closely. And I think the point he's making is that movements that fight for liberation have often not built the capacity and the capability, to take over power or to have capable institutions that have the capacity to take power when the moment arises. And we've seen that again, not only in Africa, we've seen that in Asia, although we know that post the 70s, the situation in Asia was a lot different. But we know that many societies that emerged from colonialism very often had successful civil resistance movements, but certainly did not have capable institutions to govern societies and to take us beyond successful civil resistance movements. You also have in your work this week, the idea of movement action plans, MAP, and that's a strategy to help to track the progress of movements. That's worth looking at. Conflict analysis is something we've touched on previously. There's a kind of simplified way to look at it in the literature this week. And it's essentially looking, when you're thinking about conflict analysis, at the 5 W's, right? It's what journalists use. When you're thinking about a conflict and thinking about analyzing it, you think about the who, what, where, when, and why. There's also interesting information about the 6 steps of Keynesian nonviolence. I'd encourage you to look at that also. And towards the end of your material, there's a case study on the civil rights movement in the US, but I'd also encourage you to look at other case studies from around the world. What we'll try and do later on is do a comparative analysis of civil rights movements that may have emerged in developed societies and civil rights movements that have emerged and continue to emerge in developing societies. And it might also be worth looking at, what's been happening recently in the US, for example, a movement like Black Lives Matter and the resonance that might have in other parts of the world, what the kind of similarities are and what the challenges are with a movement like that operating in a society like the US as opposed to other societies around the world. So really interesting material on this week, voluminous in many ways, so there's quite a lot to look at, but I encourage you to go through it, maybe certain segments on certain days, but I would encourage you to look through all of it. Do also look at the syllabus and the requirements in terms of the reading, in terms of choosing elements that stuck out for you, in terms of engaging the comments that are posted by your colleagues and fellow students. In many ways, the requirements for this week are similar to the one last week. So do look at the syllabus again and do look at the requirements that are set out for you this week. Keep in touch via email. Let me know if you need anything, and I will let you know about our next synchronous session, perhaps the week after next. Okay, thank you and good luck with your material for this week.